Hello?
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brian Sukup, Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for the American Society of Interior Designers. And I'm joined by Emily Kelly and Abby Rathbun, IIDA's Government Affairs staff leaders. Welcome to the third of 6 webinars in a series of jointly hosted ASID and IIDA advocacy trainings. ASID and IIDA believe that all members of the profession, ASID, IIDA, and unaffiliated, must work together to present a strong, unified front to advance and defend the profession in the legislative and regulatory arena. Today's webinar is led by Andrew Goldberg from Agora. Andrew is a seasoned government affairs professional with years of experience leading government affairs initiatives in the design and built environment industries. Finally, this is an important reminder that participants will be eligible for 0.1 credits of continuing education from IDCEC. This course is not eligible for HSW credit. All lines are muted, but if you have any questions, please use the question box function, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can by the end of the program. Without further delay, IIDA and ASID would like to welcome Andrew Goldberg. Andrew?
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. Thanks, Emily and Abigail, and good afternoon, everybody. Really happy to be here on the third of these webinar series about advocacy. In our first webinar back in February, we talked about advocacy in the general sense, what it is, why it's important to be an advocate for your profession, and the different roles that professional lobbyists and citizen advocates play. In our second webinar in early May, we got into a little more detail, and we delved into how you can build effective and lasting relationships with policymakers. Today, we're going to get even more granular and talk about how you can become a terrific advocate for your profession. We'll talk about how to conduct a successful meeting with your legislators and how to make sure that the message you are conveying is as effective as it possibly can be. Now, throughout this webinar series, we've talked about the differences between lobbyists and advocates. In short, in general, the difference is that professional lobbyists are people who do this for a living, full-time. They typically have to register at the federal level. They have to register with Congress as lobbyists, and at the state level, usually they have to register as well. Advocates, when we say that, what we mean are people who are volunteering their time. They have other jobs, other lives, but they are volunteering their time to speak up and advocate for a cause they believe in or for their profession because it's something they believe in very strongly. And being a grassroots advocate like that is not only is it really important, but it's a lot easier than a lot of people think. And there are a few reasons for that. First of all, when you are a grassroots advocate, you can be engaged at your pace. As a volunteer, you are in control of your time commitment. You can spend as much time or as little time as you can doing it. And you can advocate in a lot of different ways. If you are somebody who likes to engage with other people, then you can meet and build relationships with your elected representatives. If you're maybe a little more quiet, you can write op-eds or letters to the editor in support of your profession and do many other things. There are a lot of different ways that you can advocate, which we'll talk about today. The important thing to remember is that anybody can be an advocate. It doesn't take any kind of specialized education or some innate skills to be an advocate. All of you are passionate about your profession, and therefore speaking about it as an advocate is really quite easy. And sure, it could take a little bit of training or some tips and pointers to be the best advocate, but that's why ASID and IIDA are here to help you, to provide some of that support, like through this webinar series. Being an advocate is important and it's beneficial. It can help make you more successful in your career. Becoming engaged with community leaders and political leaders helps open opportunities for networking, meeting new people, new influencers. It helps you to hone your skills at persuading people and handling sometimes touchy or sensitive situations, skills we could all use in our business careers. And of course, by advocating for policies that help move the profession forward, you're of course helping your career by creating a better regulatory environment for interior designers to practice. Last but not least, being an advocate, it works. You can make a difference. One of the things we've talked about throughout this webinar series is that citizen advocates, by and large, are more effective and can be more successful than professional lobbyists. I worked on Capitol Hill about 20 years ago here in Washington, and I will tell you that if I had a choice between meeting with a DC lobbyist or constituents from my boss's district back home, I would always choose to meet with the constituents. They are the voters, they are the citizens who matter. And so you have that power to actually change policies and get good policies passed. So how do you do it? How do you become an advocate? What are the first steps you take? Well, like I said, it's really pretty easy. The first step is to be informed on the issues. Read the newspaper, read articles online, find out what the big issues are at the federal and state and local levels. It's especially important to be informed about what your state government is doing, because interior designers are by and large regulated at the state level. And many, if not all, state capitals have newspapers that focus in great detail on what's happening in the state capital. So read those. On the local level, there are local newspapers and radio stations and programs that focus on local politics, and get to learn the issues. That's step one. Step two, learn who your representatives are. Can you name your U.S. senators or your House rep? How about your state reps? If you don't already know this, that's okay. Find out. Go online. Find out who your representatives are. Find out what they stand for, what they're working on, what committees they're on in the legislature. Learn more about them, because those are the people that you are going to be in the best position to influence. Then learn about your association's issues. IIDA and ASID both have a robust policy agenda that you can easily find on their websites. These agendas consist of issues that they bring to the state legislatures and to Congress. And these issues focus on interior design with the goal of creating a better legal and regulatory environment for the profession. And they develop these agendas with input from the members. So these are your issues. And it's important to know where your associations stand. As we talked about a bit in some of the previous webinars, associations are so valuable in the advocacy world because they help amplify the voice of the profession. Having tens of thousands of interior designers speaking with a unified voice about issues makes you more powerful. So learn what those issues are. Next, be active in your association, not just in the advocacy, but all the activities. It'll give you a deeper understanding of the issues and challenges that your fellow interior designers are facing. It'll help you learn about advocacy opportunities that you might not otherwise have know about. Both IIDA and ASID have, many of them have local advocacy committees. You can reach out to your local heads of advocacy to find out what's going on. You can also get involved in some of the other related organizations like CIDQ and CIDA and IDEC. And that just helps you become more engaged and know what the issues are that affect the profession. Fifth, be active in your community. If you have the time, get involved with organizations or civic groups. If you are already involved, say with environmental organizations, if you're a member of the Sierra Club, for example, or even if you're involved with education groups through your kids' schools, even like the PTA, for example, that helps you gain a better understanding of the broad array of issues that are impacting your community, and also to help you meet policymakers because they engage with those groups. Even joining your local homeowners association is a way to get involved, because a lot of local elected officials, even some state officials, meet from time to time with their homeowners associations. So you can get involved that way. And then the next step then is to take action. And the easiest way to do that is through action alerts. Both IIDA and ASID, like many organizations, send out alerts to their members when there is an important bill before a state legislature or Congress. And those messages help connect you directly to your elected representatives. They tee up a message for you to send to them in support of the position, and that's a great way of getting involved. And those messages that you send to your representatives, they do work, they do have an impact. And so if you see those emails, make sure you respond to them and send a message to your elected officials. So that's how you get started. And once you do those things, you are already on the road to being an advocate. And you're ready to start taking that advocacy to the next level. So for most of this webinar, I'm going to talk about two things. First, how we create a good message that helps to make the case you want to make to policymakers, and then how to conduct a really successful meeting with legislators to kind of press your case. So to begin with, let's talk about messaging. Now, if you follow politics and listen to the pundits on TV and so on, you've probably heard this phrase, messaging and political messages. What that means in the simplest terms is messaging is the process whereby you make sure that everybody on your side is saying basically the same thing. There's an old saying in the advertising world that people need to hear a message 7 times before it sinks in. That means that unless you and your allies are stating the same thing and the same ideas over and over again to policymakers, it's going to be very hard to get that message across. It's not going to sink in. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody has to say the exact words verbatim. Everybody should speak in their own style, their own rhythm, but certainly making sure the key points are repeated over and over again. That is how you're effective at advocacy. That is how you make sure that policymakers are hearing what you have to say. Now, what does a good message, what does that entail? How do you create a good message? Well, first and foremost, a good message is concise. Now, Microsoft did a study, and they found that back in the year 2000, so about 2 decades ago, people lost concentration on something after an average of about 12 seconds. They did the study again in 2015, and they found that the attention span had dropped to 8 seconds. People lost interest in things on an average of after 8 seconds. Now, keep in mind that the attention span of a goldfish is 9 seconds. So what that means is that people today have less attention than a goldfish. You can make of that what you will. But this is why having a clear, concise message is so important. I'm sure many of you have heard the idea of the elevator pitch. The elevator pitch is this idea that you should be able to convey what you need to say to somebody while riding in an elevator. So within 30 or 45 seconds or a minute, you want to get your main point across. That is the core of developing a good advocacy message, is being able to say what you want to say concisely so that somebody can hear it, that it can be repeatable, that people can't misinterpret it, and that people can help that sink in. So how do you do that? How do you develop a concise message that does all the things you want it to do? Well, first of all, it has to have a very clear purpose. A good message identifies the core issue that you're talking about and doesn't get distracted by other issues. If you start talking about a lot of different things, the message becomes unfocused and people will lose interest. In the context of advocacy, that means being able to clearly state, here's a problem, and here's a solution that we want you, the policymaker, to support. Third, it has to be targeted to the audience, and this is a really important point. A message is not what you want to say. A message is what you believe the audience needs to hear. And so making sure that the message you provide to somebody is given in a way that they will get, they will understand, and they will respond to is very important. For example, if you're talking to a legislator, they're probably going to want to hear very clearly what can they do? What is the legislative impact or context of what you're talking about? What is the problem? What is the bill that will solve it? If you're talking to a reporter, for example, they may want to hear a little more of the human interest side, the story, so they can share that with their readers. In the political context, audience also means thinking about where a policymaker is. If you have a state rep who, let's say, is really big about supporting small business and lowering regulations, well, then you might not want to highlight your message about the environmental impacts of a policy. You may want to talk about how it helps small business. So thinking about what the audience will respond to the best is very important. A message needs to be sincere. You can have the best message in the world, but if it's not delivered in a way that shows passion or emotion, it's not going to be successful. In advocacy, being able to express yourself with passion, like you really mean it, makes it more effective. It creates more empathy in the audience, and it can inspire them to act. Now, that doesn't mean that you should go too far. Nobody wants to be shouted at. We're not saying you should yell at people what you believe. And if your legislator doesn't agree with you, yelling is not going to help. But it's very important to make sure that you really believe what you're saying and that you feel comfortable saying it. A good message also needs to be in plain English. In other words, no jargon. Now, every industry in the world has certain phrases and words that make sense to it, but that really don't resonate outside of that profession. When I worked for the architects, and this probably applies to interior designers too, I'd always use the example that, an architect might talk with other architects about fenestration or glazing. But when you're talking with a legislator, don't say fenestration or glazing, say windows. Using plain English to get your point across makes it much more effective. A good message also needs to be positive. Let's face it, people like positivity. It inspires them to act. Now, of course, that can be hard if you're advocating against a bad bill. But even then, finding a way to keep a positive message or put a positive spin on it just makes it more easier to receive. So saying, for example, we hope you oppose this bill because if you do, then interior designers can keep doing their great work. At least you're ending on a positive note, and that really helps. And last but not least, a message in the context of advocacy has a call to action. What do you want your audience to do? Your goal in advocacy is not simply to inform, it's to encourage lawmakers to do something. So be clear about what that action is. Is it to co-sponsor a piece of legislation? Is it to oppose an amendment? Is it to offer support someplace? Be very clear about what that call to action is. So those really are the elements that go into a good message. Now, another important part of this, a very important part, of course, is persuasion. Persuasion ultimately is what advocacy is about. It's convincing someone to agree with you and then agreeing to take action that you want them to take. That is the core of what we do as an advocate. And so to talk a little bit about that, we'll go back to ancient Greece. Aristotle had what he called his modes for persuasion, and they apply today to any form of persuasive speech. The three modes are ethos, which is an appeal to ethics, which is about how we convince an audience by demonstrating the authority or credibility of the persuader. There's pathos, which is an appeal to emotion, which is how we convince an audience by creating an emotional response or connection or using passion to gain support. And then logos, an appeal to logic, which is using reason, facts, and figures. A good message in the advocacy world will use all three. Making clear that you are an expert in what you're talking about, that as an interior designer, you understand these issues, helps to build that credibility, that policymakers will know that you know what you're talking about. Telling a good story, taking an abstract policy idea and talking about the real world impact of it helps make it more real and more relatable, and again, will inspire policymakers to act. But having good facts and data to back up your point is very helpful too. Now, that doesn't mean to drown your audience in tons of statistics and everything, but even a single powerful statistic can help to really build your case and build support. So I want to now give 3 examples of messages, 2 of which are not as good as they could be, and 1 which does it a little better, and to give you an example of what a message could be and what it could look like. So for this exercise, let's pretend that there's a bill, I think it's HB 1234, that would allow interior designers to bid on government projects, which I understand is an issue that happens in some states and they're not able to. So here's the first message. Interior designers can't bid on government projects. That's not fair to me. So please support HB 1234 and also make sure that buildings are more sustainable to deal with climate change. Now, is that a good message or perhaps a less effective message? I would argue it's not that effective for a few reasons. First of all, it's not really relatable to people who aren't interior designers. You say, well, that's not fair to me, but that doesn't really explain why anybody who's not an interior designer should care about it. It doesn't really explain the solution. It says support this bill, but doesn't explain what it does or why it would help. And also the message is unfocused. It's talking about procurement, but then you switch and go over to talk about climate change. An important issue to be sure, but if your purpose in this message is to get a policymaker to support you on procurement, bringing up climate change is just going to become, going to muddy the message. Here's a second example. Interior designers use layered elements to create bespoke spaces that meet the client's design program. But because we can't bid on public projects, government offices are often left with off-the-shelf solutions that fail to incorporate modular design and ergonomically appropriate furnishings. Good message, not so good message. Again, I would say this one is not as effective as it could be for a few reasons. One, it uses a fair amount of jargon that people outside the profession, outside the design world might not really relate to. More importantly, it doesn't make an ask. It doesn't talk about the bill at all. It doesn't have a call to action. It doesn't ask the policymaker to support this bill. And lastly, it ends on a very negative note. If you don't fix that, you're all going to suffer. That's kind of a downer and not really something that inspires you to act. So let's take a look at this third and final example. People spend 90% of their time indoors, which is why interior designers like me get extensive education to curate healthy, vibrant, and safe spaces. But the law prevents us from bidding on public projects, wasting taxpayer money, and hurting small business people. That's why I urge you to support HB 1234, which ends this prohibition and lets businesses compete on a level playing field. And how's that? Well, a couple of things. One, it uses data. Not a lot of data, but it uses one statistic. 90% of the time people spend is indoors, which is from the EPA, by the way. It establishes expertise. That's that ethos we talked about. It says interior designers get extensive education to create healthy, vibrant, safe spaces. It talks a lot about how these problems affects people who are not interior designers, whether it's how people spend their time indoors and therefore interior designers help them. It talks about how the current law wastes taxpayer money, hurts the taxpayers, and how it hurts small business. It's not just focused on the impact on interior designers, but it's broader than that. And it has a clear ask. It says, I urge you to support this bill, which does this. And it talks about what the bill does, and it ends on a more positive note, letting business compete on a level playing field. I mean, who'd be against that? So in developing your message, you really want to think about some of those elements that make a good message and develop it in a way that sounds sincere to you, but really thinks about what the audience will respond to. Now, to kind of sum things up a little bit, I want to offer a couple of last little do's and don'ts about messaging. First, the don'ts. First of all, don't make things up. If you want to use facts and figures or make factual assertions, make sure they are real and you can back them up. It may not feel this way all the time, but it matters in the policy world to use facts that are provable and citable. Don't try to do too much. As we said, you want to keep your message focused and straightforward. You don't want to try to solve the world and deal with every issue in the world. You want to really focus on the core ask and the core goal of what you're trying to get across. Also, don't make your opponent's argument for them. It may be that whatever policy you're supporting and advocating on, that there are those who are against it. Well, let them make that case for them. Don't argue, don't make the argument for them. At the same time, don't bash your opponents. Remember, part of the reason why interior designers are well respected in state houses and in Congress is because they are professionals, and you want to be viewed as a sincere professional. And bashing or bad mouthing your opponents doesn't really help that, and it and it gets you away from that positivity that is so important. Again, on the other side, a couple of do's. Do convey authority. That's ethos. Make sure that you talk about how you know these issues firsthand because you are an interior designer. Target your message. Think about who the message is going to and what they will respond to best. Make sure you address the problem and the solution and the ask. Make sure those parts of it are there because that is the core of what advocacy is. Here's a problem. We have a solution. We want you to help us move that solution forward. And last but not least, convey it with passion and sincerity. Show that you really mean it and you really care about this, which shouldn't be hard because these are issues that you do care about as interior designers. So make sure that passion and that sincerity actually comes through. Okay, so now you developed your message and you've done your action alerts and you've become an advocate, and now it's time to actually go and meet with a member of the State House or a member of Congress. What do you do? Now, I'll tell you that when I worked on Capitol Hill about 20 years ago, I would see so many professionals, CEOs of companies, very established, distinguished people come in and be really intimidated when they met with me. And I was a 23-year-old kid, and yet these people who are much older than me, much more accomplished, would get a little nervous. And the truth is that sometimes some people do get a little bit nervous or scared about meeting with an elected official or their staff. They're afraid that they won't say the right thing, or they'll make a bad argument, or that the legislator will pepper them with questions they can't answer. Here's the reality. There's no reason to be nervous. First of all, it is the job of legislators to meet with their constituents. That's what they do. And they do it all the time. And they know that you are not a professional lobbyist. They know that you are a citizen volunteering your time. They don't expect you to know the details of every single bill or all the details of every single policy. What they do want to hear from you is what you already know, what it means to be an interior designer, how certain laws or policies you're talking about affect your practice and your ability to be an interior designer. And that's what they want to hear about. Also, don't be nervous because remember, at the end of the day, you are their boss. You get to decide every few years whether or not they get to keep their job. If anything, they should be nervous about meeting you because you hold that power over them. So my 2 rules for meeting with legislators, the first 2 rules are 1, don't panic, and rule 2, see rule number 1. So we're going to go through a little bit about what it's like to meet with a legislator if you haven't done it before, what you should expect, what you should be thinking about beforehand, and then what the meeting should look like or feel like. So first of all, a couple of sort of reality checks. If you haven't done this before, if you haven't gone to the state capitol or to the US Capitol or even the City Hall to advocate, you may have some misperceptions or ideas about what it should be like. And it's important to have an understanding of what the reality is. First of all, is be flexible. Even when you schedule a meeting with somebody, a legislator, they may need to move it at the last minute, or they might be delayed, or they may have to cut it short. When the legislature is in session, there are a million things going on, and legislators and their staffs are being pulled in a million different directions. It's not their fault, it's just the nature of the way things happen. So you have to be a little bit flexible about that and kind of go with the flow. Related to that, you yourself, you want to leave extra time when you have these meetings. If the meeting is in DC, at Capitol Hill especially, and even in many state houses, there may be security that you have to go through in long lines. Some buildings, Capitol buildings or legislative buildings, can be somewhat confusing. And so you may take some time to figure out where you're going. Also, I'll just mention one other piece of advice that's very helpful is, while you want to dress for these meetings in a business-like manner, you want to dress comfortably, because if you have a bunch of meetings, you may be bouncing back and forth between a lot of different offices. And make sure you wear rubber-soled shoes, because a lot of the floors in these buildings are marble, and hard shoes can really hurt after a while. The meeting you have with the legislator, it might not be in the best space. It might be in a small, crowded room that is noisy and distracting. It might be in a hallway or a public space, like a cafeteria, if they don't have any space. There were times when I worked on Capitol Hill where my boss, the member of Congress, would actually meet with a constituent while they were walking from their office to the Capitol to vote. You may have a meeting that you have to do that way, where you're actually walking. And so it may not be the most ideal space to have a meeting in, but again, it's one of those realities you have to kind of go with the flow a little bit. Keep in mind that you also might meet with staff, and this is especially true at the federal level, maybe not quite as much at the state level. At the federal level, members of Congress and senators have legislative staff, less so again at the state level, but the fact of the matter is, if a legislator is double or triple booked, you might have to meet with a staff person. Now, that staff person will probably be pretty young. Like I said, I was 23 when I was on the Hill, but don't be put off. The staffers are usually very smart. They know the issues. And remember, they are the ones who advise their bosses on issues. So making a good case to them is going to be very helpful. And knowing the staff is really important because they will probably be your point of contact moving forward. And they also move around from office to office. And so building a connection to them may help you get in and meet with other policymakers down the line. Last but not least, remember that results do take time. Don't expect that the first time you meet with a legislator, they're going to agree with everything you say and want to help you with everything and do everything. Most of the time, they'll want to review your asks, review what bills you want them to support. They may want to do some research, talk to their colleagues, and so on. And that's perfectly fine. We're going to talk a little bit later about follow-up, but just remember that a single meeting with a legislator isn't the end goal of a relationship. It takes more than that. It takes more sustained engagement, but that meeting is an important part. Now, as I talked about before, a key part of any kind of message or persuasion is knowing your audience and knowing what they are looking for and kind of what's going on in their head from their perspective. So for a second, I want you all to kind of pretend that you are a state representative, a member of Congress, to get a sense of kind of what's going on in their mind when they meet with you. Well, first of all, you're probably a little bit distracted. You have a zillion things going on in your head. You probably have 10, 20 meetings that day with different constituent groups on top of the 10 or 20 you had the day before and the 20 you have the next day. There are committee hearings you need to attend. There are going to be votes on certain bills. You may have to give a speech later on to some group. There may be receptions tonight. There are all sorts of things going on. So again, you're probably, while you want to give as much attention and brain energy to what your constituents are saying to you, yeah, you're probably going to be a little bit distracted. And so certainly you hope that the people who are coming in, the advocates, are going to be very clear about what they want. Second of all, you probably care more than anything else about your district, the people you represent, the folks back home. Even if you're in Congress at a national level, you still care primarily about people back home, and you really want to hear about how issues and solutions affect your community. You also want to have a clear sense of what problems people bring to you and solutions. When I was on the Hill, again, to me, the best meetings were when somebody would come in and say, here's a big problem, and explain it clearly, and here's a solution, a bill or an amendment or something that fixes it, and really kind of spells it out for me. Most state representatives and Congress people don't really have the capacity, because they're so distracted, to really think a lot about the solution or think about the problems. The more you can hand them something and say, here is a problem and a solution tied up in a nice, neat bow, as a legislator, you really appreciate that. As a legislator, you also don't like surprises. One of the worst things that can happen is somebody comes in to you with a bill. You think it sounds like a great idea, non-controversial, a no-brainer, and so you support it and you put out a press release saying you support it, and all of a sudden all these people start criticizing you for supporting this bill they oppose. Even if you don't mind taking a controversial position, you want to know about it beforehand. You do want to know. And so if, from the standpoint of being an advocate, if a legislator does ask you, well, is there any opposition to this? You want to tell them that. You want to be upfront. Like I said, you don't want to make the arguments for your opponent, but certainly if they ask you, well, is anybody against this? If there is, it helps to build trust to say, yeah, there is a group here that maybe doesn't like this. You then want to go back to your message and talk about why it's a good idea. why the other side is wrong, but you certainly want to make sure that there are no surprises. And lastly, legislators like to find the easiest way to help. And what that means is this: if you come into a legislator with two asks, two bills you want them to support, one is a very easy, non-controversial bill, and one's a little more controversial, a legislator is probably going to tend towards wanting to support the non-controversial one and say, well, I can help you there because it's easier. But the problem is, if the one you really want their support on is the more controversial one, you may not get that. And so certainly from the standpoint of being an advocate, talking and highlighting sometimes the more complicated issue or the tougher ask, you might not want to ask for a bunch of easy things as well. And by the same token, come in with a list of like 10 or 15 different things you want them to do. Co-sponsor this bill, vote this way, write this letter, go to this event, because again, you want to keep things as simple as possible. So that's really kind of what's going on in their mind, and give you a sense of kind of what their thought process is or what they're looking for when you go into a meeting. Now, how should the actual meeting itself go? And it depends a lot on the kind of meeting it is. If you've met this legislator before, it may be a little different. If it's somebody you've had a good relationship with for years and years, or on the other hand, if it's somebody perhaps who hasn't always been on your side, it might be a little bit different how the meeting goes. For now, let's just assume that this is a meeting with somebody you haven't met before, a state rep, let's say, who maybe they're new, you haven't engaged with before, maybe you don't really know where they are on the issues, kind of a basic intro meeting. Every meeting is different, but here are some basic outline of how the meeting should go. First of all, the introductions. You want to talk about who you are and where you're from. That's important. Talk about where you're from, especially if you are from their district. If you can even say you're from this neighborhood or you went to that high school or whatever, the more you connect to that district, which again, they care about, the better. It really builds some automatic instant connections. And talk about what you do, that you are an interior designer, that you're perhaps coming up there working with other members of ASID or IIDA. Make sure they know that you are coming from the interior designers and that's why you're there. And so it's good to have a little bit of small talk like any business meeting. If it's a little bit rushed, you may want to, cut that down a little bit, but you don't want to come right in and start with the business. You don't want to come in immediately and say, hi, I'm Bob. Here's what I want you to do. Getting to know them is an important part of that relationship. Then you get kind of into the meat of the meeting. In my last webinar, we talked about the three parts of building that relationship are educating, listening, and sustaining. Let's talk about educating. This is the part where really that message you developed comes into play. You're talking about why interior design matters, why it's an important profession. You're talking about here's a problem we have. We're not allowed to bid on projects, government projects, for example, or whatever it is. And here's a solution. We have a bill, or there is a bill that would fix this problem. And last but not least, there is the ask. It is saying to them, we would like you to co-sponsor this bill, or we want you to oppose this amendment. And it's important to be clear about that. I've been in meetings at times where people say, HR 1234 is a really great bill, thank you. And that's not really an ask. An ask is, we would like you to co-sponsor this bill, or even will you co-sponsor this bill? That's the part where you really get to provide that message and talk about why you are there. The next part is the listening part. And remember, this is a relationship. It's a two-way street. You want to hear from them. You want to get their reactions to what you said. You might want to hear, they may want to talk about what they're working on that relates to your issues. You want to kind of get their reactions. Now, sometimes you might get some tough questions from a legislator about a bill or an issue that you've brought up. If you're asking them to co-sponsor a bill, they may ask you, well, who opposes this bill? Or how much will this bill cost? Or where does Chairman so-and-so of the so-and-so committee feel about this? Let's say you don't know the answer to those questions, or you're not sure how to answer. Well, the first rule, again, don't panic. Second, don't make stuff up. If you don't know the answer to a question, say, I'm not sure, I'll get back to you. That's totally fine. Again, they know that you are a constituent. You are a grassroots advocate. You're not a professional lobbyist. It's okay not to know the answer. Just make sure you do follow up. If they do disagree with you, they say, well, I don't think that bill's a good idea or whatever, don't make the disagreement personal. Certainly, you want to hear their point of view, you hear their ideas. If they say, well, I heard from this other group that said it's a bad idea, like I said, you don't want to badmouth the competition or your opponents, but you can say, well, I know that so-and-so doesn't support this legislation because they think it'll do this, but in reality, this bill is good, and here are the reasons, and it gives you a chance to reiterate those reasons. You also want to be able to steer conversations back to your issues. There are times that legislators will either intentionally or not kind of go off on tangents on other issues. You want to listen to them, but you also want to make sure that you get back to your issue in a polite way. So you can say, so going back to the issue of procurement or whatever, you want to be able to make sure you have a chance to make sure they what you say. And as I said, of course, you want to stay positive throughout all of this. Now, you also may get some more out of left field questions because you are interior designers, and this happens to every profession in different ways. You may get some questions like, so how can I redecorate my office? Or, I once worked with an interior designer and I wasn't happy with the results, so why should I listen to you? Or, well, I watch HGTV, so I know why it should, I know that it should only take, a few minutes or a few days to do a project. You may hear some things where they express either a negative view or somewhat, let's say, naive or uninformed view about the profession. You want to provide accurate information, think of it as an opportunity, again, to educate, and you want to be diplomatic. You want to accentuate the positive. And also just keep in mind that providing free design services to an elected official, other than maybe casual pointers, could run afoul of ethics rules, so you want to be a little bit careful there. Now, part of that listening process, again, is you want to get their reaction to what your ask is and getting to yes. And the goal is to get them to support your position. And if you're lucky, they will say, yes, I agree with you. Yes, I will support your request. I will co-sponsor the bill or whatever. In reality, most legislators won't commit right away. They want to do some research. They want to talk to their staff or whatever, and that's totally fine. We'll talk in a bit about following up. Now, one thing that happens sometimes is a legislator will say something that sounds like yes, but really isn't. And then you go back and tell everybody that your congressman or your state rep supported this bill, and they're really not. And so one thing I always told members at AIA is, look out for some of those phrases that sound like yes, but really aren't. For example, that bill sounds great, or I agree, this is an important issue, or I'd love to work with you. Those don't mean yes. The only word that means yes is yes. Yes, I will co-sponsor that bill. Anything other than that may sound supportive, which is good, but it's not a commitment to then do what you ask them to do. So what happens? What if they don't say yes, or even if they do say yes? What next? However well that meeting goes, one meeting does not make a relationship. A relationship requires a sustained engagement. And so you want to be able to end the meeting with working to build that sustained engagement. So if you've made an ask of the legislator and they say, we'll get back to you, which is fine, ask them, okay, when? Try to get a commitment. Can we come back to you in a week or 2 weeks and find out? What that does, it lets them know that you're going to stay on them. You are not, you want to get an answer and you're going to be engaged. You can also offer more information if you have other statistics or examples of projects that help reinforce your case. You can offer to share that with them. That's a great way to show that you are a trusted resource of good information. Another thing you can do, which too few groups actually do, is ask if there's anything you can do to help them. Remember, this is a two-way street. You want to work with them. Policymakers like to hear people come in and not just ask for something, but say, can I help you? Maybe they have a bill they're working on. They want your feedback, or maybe they're trying to organize a meeting or something in the district and they can get some help. That's great. You want to work with them. You can invite them to an event or a tour. If there's the ASID or IIDA chapter has an event, invite them. Or if you want to invite them to visit your office, your firm, or a project, it's a way of helping to build that connection. Ask them about how else they can connect. Do they do town halls? Do they have constituent days at the supermarket? Find out how you can be involved with them. Remember to take a photo, and if you're on social media, post it there. Remember to link or tag the representative, say, hey, I had a great meeting with, state rep so-and-so. Also share that photo with ASID and IIDA, because they can then share that as well. And if you have leave behinds, which obviously are documents that ASID or IIDA provide to leave with the legislator to provide more information, remember to leave them. At the end, then the meeting is over. You thank them for their time, no matter how well or bad the meeting went. Thank them, exchange business cards. If they have staff, find out how the best way to reach them is. And remember, a day or so afterwards, to send a thank you note. Thank them for meeting with you and use that as a chance to reinforce the messages that you put forward. And that really is the meeting. Let me offer just a couple of quick do's and don'ts for meetings, just to make sure that you are doing everything well, which, as I said, is not hard. On the don't side, don't tell a legislator that you voted against them, even if you did. That's not the best way to really build a relationship, to say, well, I didn't support you, but please help me. Keep politics out of it. Don't discuss, politics, as I said, or donations. Certainly never say, well, if you support this bill, I'll write you a campaign check. That's kind of called bribery, which is, kind of illegal, and so don't do that. Again, don't make things up. If you don't know something, say you don't know it, and you'll get back to them. Don't badmouth your competitors or opponents. If there are disagreements and they ask about it, you can talk about where you disagree, but don't badmouth folks on the other side of the. Remember that your opponents today could be allies tomorrow on a different set of issues. Again, don't be annoyed if they disagree with you. Just reiterate your key points, and don't read from talking points. ASID and IIDA will often provide talking points before meetings for their members, and you should study them beforehand, read them, get familiar. But when you get to the meeting, remember, be yourself. Just talk. Don't read a script. On the other side, the do's. Again, be enthusiastic, show passion. Remember to tell them where you're from, what neighborhood even, so they know you're from the district. Remember to make that ask. Offer to follow up, offer to provide more information, and then do it. And last but not least, be yourself, and most of all, have fun, because that's the key point here. Being able to go and talk to your elected representatives, that is the core of what democracy is about. And so you should enjoy the experience. It is fun to go up to the state capitol or the U.S. Capitol or City Hall or wherever and talk to your elected representatives. Enjoy the experience, because you are making a positive difference. And don't worry that you're going to say something wrong. It is easy to do. And like I said, it makes a real difference. So really quick now, we're about to wrap up. Let's say you've done all those things. You've done your visit to the Capitol. You've met with your representatives. Is there more you can do? How do you step up and become a super advocate? And organizations like IIDA and ASID really depend upon having members become engaged and even more engaged. And that really builds their voice and their influence. So you can help with a Capitol Hill Day. Many of the state chapters will do a day where they bring folks up to Capitol Hill. If you've done that already, maybe help out the next time. You could accompany attendees to one of their meetings. If there's somebody who's doing it for the first time, they're a little nervous, you can now be their mentor and help them a little bit and go. You can also help them offer to help organize logistics or help in identifying sponsors to defray some of the costs. I said you could host a site visit, inviting a legislator to your office or to a project. You can write op-eds or letters to the editor on these issues. That helps to reinforce the message. Go on social media, tweet about it, put it on Facebook. That becomes shareable and shows broader support. You can testify at a hearing. In, I think, all state capitals and committees, when they have hearings on issues, you can just sign up and you can then testify. It's a great way to show your support and get the message out there. Join an advocacy committee. ASID, IIDA have advocacy committees at all levels, local, state, national. Join that, become part of the leadership that really helps guide their advocacy, and spread the word. If you go up to your state capitol, have a great experience, tell 2 other interior designers about it and encourage them to do it. If everybody who does that tells a couple of people and they do it and they tell 2 people and so on, that just builds the collective power of the association and of the profession to create a better regulatory and legal environment. So to sum up, again, key points: anybody can be an advocate. Anybody can do this. It is not hard. It is well worth it, and it's important. The first step is to become informed and engaged in the issues, the big issues that happen at the national level, state, local, and also the issues that your association is working on. Successful advocacy messaging, remember, it's concise, it's relatable, it's targeted, and it includes a call to action. A message is not what you want to say, it's what you want your audience to hear. Know your audience and tailor your message to hit the points that matter to them. Having a successful meeting with a legislator starts with understanding what your legislator is looking for and will respond to. That makes it more successful. You want to meet them halfway, essentially. And remember that that meeting is not the culmination of a relationship, but the start or one piece of it. And sustaining it creates real champions for the profession in the legislator. And last but not least, becoming a super advocate is easy, and it helps your association, it helps your profession, and they're going to help you become a really great advocate and leader who's going to help create a much better environment and regulatory state for the profession and help interior designers get ahead. So with that, I want to thank you. I want to throw it back to Brian and Emily and Abigail. And if folks have any questions for us, I'm happy to take them.
Well, thank you, Andrew. That was great. We will now take some questions until the top of the hour. The question and answer period will not be recorded. Please use your question box to ask these questions, and due to time constraints, we won't be able to answer all the questions, but Andrew, Abby, Emily, and myself are all available by email if you do have any follow-up questions. So again, please get those questions in using your question box. And Andrew, the first question is, what if my legislator or the staff doesn't respond to my letter or request for a meeting?
Okay, that's a good question, because sometimes, unfortunately, they won't do that. A couple of things to do. In the last webinar, we talked a little bit about what is known as power mapping, which is where you really try to identify kind of the people who influence, the people or entities who are close to that legislator. Remember that all legislators at every level and their staff are people, and they're part of a community. They went to school with people. They're on LinkedIn. They're involved in other organizations. And so doing some research on them, finding out where their big interests are, and then finding out kind of who you know in the profession can help you get to them. So one example is if you have you might find out that a certain legislator, their kids go to a certain school and they're in the PTA. Well, you may know somebody who's in the PTA, and as a way of connecting to them. Or if you have another member of the legislature who is a champion for you, you could ask them and say, hey, we're trying to get to your colleague, state rep so-and-so, can you help us? So I think it's kind of expanding a little bit that universe of people you ask to try to get in front of them. And you can always go to their town halls where they have them and meet them there.
Thanks, Andrew. The next question is it okay to reach out to my legislator or my legislative staff if I don't have an ask, if I just want to educate or build a relationship?
That's a very good question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. In fact, in an ideal world, what everybody would do is first kind of meet with their legislators even before they're in office and do some of that educating, and certainly coming in before an issue is ripe or the issue is hot, to talk a little bit about who interior designers are and what they do is very useful. Even then, you may want to just allude to kind of the general universe of what your issues are and why you care about policy. But we talked about this in the last webinar also. Going up to a legislator who you haven't met before, even talked to, and without having any relationship and saying, please support our issue, is not as effective as having that relationship. So if you're at a point where you don't have any hot pressing issues or nothing, that's okay. Still, you want to reach out and engage. You're part of the community. There probably will be issues that will come up at some point, and so educating them at that point is perfectly fine.
Thanks, Andrew. This is in the same vein. What if I don't have a solution for the legislator? What if I just want to kill a piece of legislation?
Well, I mean, in a way, that is the solution, I suppose. So if playing defense on advocacy is just as important as offense. If the current law, the current regulations are fine, and there's somebody has proposed a bill that would change that in a negative way, well, then the solution is let's keep things the way they are because they work. So in a lot of ways, the messaging may be a little bit, as I said, a little different because again, there's a inherently negative aspect to it. You're saying oppose this, but at that point, then you really want to talk about how, the current state is fine. The problem is people are trying to mess up with the current state essentially, and the solution would be let's keep it the same way. And that's a lot of what happens in advocacy is not always pushing a positive solution to a problem, but it's also playing defense. It's preventing some bad ideas from going forward.
So we have time for one more. Andrew, a major issue for us is misperceptions about what interior designers actually do. How can I educate my legislator and or staff and persuade them and have an ask for them if I just have a few minutes for a meeting?
Well, that's a good question. So a couple of points to that. As I said, in the ideal world, first of all, remember that one meeting, a single meeting, even if it is a half hour, which is probably the most you would get ideally, you're not going to build a trusting, collaborative relationship in that time. It may take a few engagements. That's why getting in with your legislators as early as possible to start that education process is really important. Yeah, and you're right, it can be if they have serious misperceptions about what interior designers do, which then impacts their positions on some of these issues. That is a lot to unpack in one meeting. What I would say, and also Brian and Emily may have thoughts as well, because this is something I'm sure you've encountered. I think having a very concise, clear message starts, but again, it's remembering that a single meeting is not. You shouldn't try to do everything in that single meeting. You want to recognize it may take a few engagements to really build up that trust, that knowledge, that education, so that helps you then when the policy questions come up.
Well, thank you, Andrew. This was great. We're almost at the top of the hour, so we'll conclude today's session. We look forward to hosting Andrew and all of you on our next joint profession-wide advocacy training webinar in late August. Additionally, next month's ASID will host another organization to be determined for the next installment in its public policy webinar series. All are welcome, so stay tuned for details. We hope you enjoyed today's session and that you'll tell your colleagues and chapter members about these webinars. And as always, please remember to text interior design, 2 words, interior design, to 52886 for up-to-the-date text alerts on all advocacy initiatives for ASID and IIDA. Again, thank you, Andrew, for a great webinar. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 months. Have a great day.